Have you ever walked into a room and felt like you had just become the subject of a conversation that ended right before you arrived? No one says anything, but that silence says everything. Avoided eye contact, the atmosphere turns awkward, and then, like a piece falling perfectly into place, you realize someone has been talking about you behind your back. Not direct criticism, not honest feedback, but words spoken when you're not there, where you can't explain, can't defend yourself, can't speak up. And what hurts isn't the content of what was said, but the person who said it. A friend, someone you once trusted, shared things with, someone you believed was on your side. In this video, we're going to break down a truth that few people say out loud: the real psychology of those who talk behind others' backs, what they think, what they lack, and why they choose this way instead of facing things directly. If you've ever experienced that feeling, or simply want to understand human nature more deeply in moments like this, stay until the end because what comes next might completely change how you see this. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss more deep psychological content like this. But at a deeper layer of this phenomenon, we begin to see a much more complex truth, one that is no longer simply about who is right, who is wrong, but about how humans operate within invisible social spaces. Because sometimes talking behind someone's back doesn't begin with clear malice, but with a very human need to belong. Observe a group of people when they first meet: the initial awkwardness, the safe small talk, the uncomfortable silences. But all it takes is one person lowering their voice and saying something that feels like a private sharing about a third person, and suddenly the atmosphere shifts. People lean in closer, attention increases, a sense of we're on the same side begins to form. That is not accidental. In social psychology, there is a phenomenon called alliance through a shared target. When two people share an evaluation, especially a negative one, about someone else, they unconsciously create a rapid sense of bonding. No long time is needed to build trust. No deep experiences are required. Just the third person as a backdrop, and a simulated intimacy is created almost instantly. But the problem is, this type of connection is not based on understanding, but on exclusion. It doesn't say, I like you for who you are, but implicitly says, I stand on your side because we both don't like that person. And that is a very fragile foundation. Because if a relationship is built on speaking badly about others, then logically, that very relationship can also become the subject of other conversations when you are not present. That is why people who frequently engage in this type of connection tend to feel uneasy, even when they are in a group. They laugh, they blend in, but somewhere in their mind, there is always an unspoken question: when I leave, will they talk about me this way? And the answer is often yes. Not because they are specifically targeted, but because they are within a communication system whose nature is exactly like that. This leads us to an even deeper psychological layer: habit. Not everyone who talks behind others' backs does so with clear awareness. For many people, it is simply how they have learned to communicate, growing up in environments where information about others is always the center of conversations, where evaluation, comparison, and judgment become a normal part of daily interaction. Over time, the brain begins to associate this behavior with social rewards: attention, laughter, agreement, a sense of acceptance. And like any behavior that is repeatedly rewarded, it becomes the default. They don't stop to ask themselves, is this fair? They simply continue, does this make the conversation more interesting? And often it does, but the cost does not appear immediately. It accumulates over time in how others begin to see them, in the level of trust that gradually erodes in relationships that never reach true depth. Because at some level, humans have a very subtle ability. They can sense when someone is not safe to open up to. No concrete evidence needed, no direct experience required, just small signals: the way that person talks about others, the tone when telling stories, the excessive enjoyment when mentioning someone's mistakes. All of these create a quiet but powerful impression. If I open up to this person, where will that information go next? And when that question appears, real intimacy stops. The irony is that many people who talk behind others' backs are actually searching for the very thing their behavior is destroying: genuine connection. They want closeness, they want trust, they want acceptance. But instead of building it through honesty and emotional safety, they choose a faster path, but a hollow one, a path based on information, not understanding, based on reaction, not empathy. And that is why, if you observe long enough, you will notice a repeating pattern. Conversations always revolve around others. Stories always contain elements of judgment, and there is rarely enough silence for a truly deep connection to form. But when you understand all of this, a subtle shift begins to happen in how you view your original experience. The betrayal still hurts, that is real, but it no longer carries the same meaning as before. It is no longer evidence that you are not good enough or not worthy of respect, but a signal, a piece of data about someone else's psychological system, a small window into their inner world, how they process insecurity, how they seek connection, how they regulate their own emotions. And when you see it that way, you are no longer trapped in the question, why did they do this to me? Instead, you begin to ask a much more powerful question. What does this say about them? And where should I set my boundaries? That is the turning point, where an experience that once hurt you begins to become a form of understanding, not to justify the behavior, but so that you are no longer controlled by it. But it is precisely at this point, when we clearly see those small but repeated psychological rewards, that an important truth begins to emerge. Talking behind someone's back does not persist because it is right, but because it is effective in the short term. It is like a kind of mental sugar. In that very moment, the speaker feels more relieved, more confident, more connected. They may even feel like they understand the world better. But like anything that delivers quick rewards, it does not build a sustainable foundation. On the contrary, it quietly erodes far more important things: trust, respect, and the depth of relationships. Imagine you are in a conversation and someone begins to share negative stories about a person who is not present. At first, you might get drawn in. You might nod. You might even add a few details. But at the same time, at a deeper level of awareness, you are registering something else. This is how they talk about others. And from that moment, a subtle defense mechanism begins to activate. You become more selective about what you share. You think more carefully before opening up. You hold back a part of yourself, not because you don't want to connect, but because you are not sure whether that connection is safe. That is the invisible cost of talking behind others' backs. It does not only affect the person being talked about, it also shapes how people perceive the one who is speaking, even if they never say it out loud. And over time, this creates a paradox. The more people use gossip to create connection, the more they weaken their ability to create real connection. Because real connection does not come from judging others together. It comes from the courage to show up authentically, with both strengths and weaknesses. But for those who are used to using other people's reputation as a communication tool, shifting to that kind of authenticity is not easy. It requires something they often avoid: vulnerability. Saying I feel not good enough is much harder than saying she's not as good as people think. Admitting I'm jealous is much harder than saying he just got lucky. Saying I feel threatened is much harder than implying that someone else has a problem. And so, instead of facing their real emotions, they transform them into stories about others. This is the deeper psychological mechanism at work: redirection. What is not processed internally will be expressed externally, often in indirect and hard to notice ways. But what is noteworthy is this: not everyone is aware of it. For many people, they do not feel like they are doing anything wrong. They are just having a normal conversation. They are just sharing opinions. They are just retelling what they heard. And that is why this behavior can persist for a long time without being questioned, until it comes back to affect them directly. Because sooner or later, the people around them begin to recognize the pattern. They may not confront it directly, but they will adjust how they interact. They will keep their distance. They will choose others to share more important things with. And the person who was once at the center of conversations begins to feel excluded from deeper connections. The irony is that at this point, they may continue using the same strategy, talking about others, to cope with that feeling of exclusion. And the cycle continues. But when you understand this entire mechanism, something important happens. You no longer see gossip the same way. You begin to see it as a signal, not a signal about your value, but a signal about the psychological state of the speaker. You begin to distinguish more clearly between those who can build connection based on authenticity and those who can only connect through comparison and judgment. And from there, you have a choice. You can choose not to participate in such conversations. You can choose to redirect the topic. You can choose to remain silent, not because you are weak, but because you do not want to reinforce a communication system you know is unhealthy. And more importantly, you can choose how to build your own relationships according to a different standard, a standard where trust is not traded for entertainment, where respect is not sacrificed for attention, where people are evaluated based on how they treat others directly, not on what they say when others are not present. Because in the end, what truly shapes a person's reputation is not what they say about themselves, but how they speak about others when no one is forcing them to be kind. And when you realize that, you not only understand more about those who talk behind others' backs, you also understand more clearly the standard you want to uphold for yourself. And when you go deep enough into this loop, you begin to realize something even more subtle. Talking behind others' backs is not just a behavior, it gradually becomes an operating identity. It's not that they occasionally talk about others, it's that the way they see the world always passes through a lens of comparison. Every encounter becomes a measurement. Every person becomes a reference point. Every story becomes an opportunity to reposition themselves within an invisible system of who is better than whom. And when that happens for long enough, they no longer truly see who others really are. They only see position. Who stands out more? Who is more liked? Who is receiving more attention? Who could become a potential threat? In such a world, talking behind others' backs is no longer a choice. It becomes a tool to adjust social perception, a tool to reduce the pressure of comparison, a tool to rebalance what they feel is tipping in someone else's favor. But the cost of operating this way is enormous and often not immediately recognized, because when you constantly view others through a lens of judgment, you unconsciously apply the same standard to yourself. You become more sensitive to how others see you. You worry more about your image. You become more alert to small shifts in the attitudes of people around you. In other words, you don't just create an unsafe environment for others, but for yourself as well. And that is one of the deepest paradoxes of this behavior. Those who try to control others' reputations are often the ones most obsessed with their own. They constantly ask themselves, how am I being perceived? Are they saying something about me? Am I being underestimated? And because they know how they themselves have spoken about others, they easily believe that others will do the same to them. This is no longer just social behavior. It is a continuous psychological state, a kind of background tension they carry into their relationships. But when you understand this, a very important shift happens in how you respond to gossip. You are no longer pulled into its specific content, no longer overly concerned with what was said, who heard it, or how accurate it is. Instead, you begin to look at the pattern, frequency, tone, context, and most importantly, the underlying motive. You begin to realize that repeated gossip is not a series of isolated events, but the expression of a stable psychological system. And when you see that system, you no longer need to react to every small detail. You can make a clearer decision. Is this an environment you want to continue investing emotional energy in? This does not mean you become cold or detached. On the contrary, it allows you to become intelligently selective. You begin to distinguish between those who can process their emotions directly and those who always need a third person to release them, between conversations that are constructive and those that only provide short-term stimulation, between relationships with depth and those based on exchanging information about others. And from there, you set boundaries, not through aggressive confrontation, but through internal clarity. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need to refute every rumor. You don't need to control how others tell stories about you. Because you understand one core truth. A reputation built over time is not determined by short, absent conversations. Those who truly observe you through your actions, through how you treat them, through your consistency over time, will form their own perception independent of rumors. And those who rely only on secondhand stories never truly knew you in the first place. This clarity brings a very different kind of freedom. You are no longer pulled into constantly fixing your image. You are no longer obsessed with controlling the narrative. You no longer feel the need to appear perfect in every situation. Instead, you focus on what you can actually control: how you behave when present, how you speak about others when they are not present, and the standard you choose to uphold, even when no one is watching. Because in the end, what distinguishes you from those trapped in the cycle of gossip is not that you never feel emotions like comparison or insecurity. It is that you choose not to turn those emotions into stories about others. You process them in a more direct way, more honest, more mature. And that choice, repeated over time, is what truly shapes who you are, not what others say behind your back.